Welcome back to Macro Matters. Today, we're diving deep into the G7 and BRICS countries, focusing on a fascinating economic face-off between these powerful groups. We're covering GDP, GDP per capita, and how their economies have evolved over the past 40 years, so let's see who has come out on top. First, let's introduce our main players. The G7, or Group of Seven, includes the United States, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the United Kingdom. Formed in the mid-1970s, the G7 represented the world's most advanced economies, sharing similar political systems, wealth levels, and economic goals. Now let's talk about BRICS. Representing a more diverse mix, BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Originally coined as BRIC by economist Jim O'Neill in 2001, South Africa joined the group in 2010. While BRICS countries were historically considered emerging markets, they've since become major players on the global stage. Let's start by comparing total GDP, the measure of all goods and services produced in a country. In 1980, the G7 was the undisputed economic powerhouse, making up over 60% of the world's total GDP. At this time, BRICS economies were smaller and mostly developing, but as the years progressed, the story changed, especially in the 2000s. China's economic reforms kicked into high gear, and India experienced rapid growth in services and technology. By 2010, BRICS held around 25% of global GDP, up from just 10% in 1990. Fast forward to 2024, and the BRICS economies collectively rival the G7. While the G7 still holds the lead with about 30% of global GDP, BRICS is not far behind, nearing 27%. This rapid growth is largely thanks to China and India, which have driven much of the group's GDP surge. Next, let's look at GDP per capita. This metric shows the average economic output per person in each country. In 1980, G7 countries had a massive advantage, with GDP per capita levels nearly 10 times higher than those in BRICS. Throughout the years, G7 countries have maintained this advantage. By 2024, the average GDP per capita in G7 countries remains around $50,000, while BRICS, despite their growth, average closer to $9,000. China and Russia have driven much of BRICS per capita growth, though significant disparities exist within BRICS. For instance, China's GDP per capita has surpassed $12,000, while India's sits around $2,500 in 2024. What drives the differences? Why has the G7 kept its GDP per capita lead, even as BRICS's total GDP rises? One key factor is development maturity. The G7 nations had a head start with industrialization, advanced infrastructure, and highly educated populations. Meanwhile, BRICS nations, particularly India and China, experienced massive population growth and only more recently scaled up their industries. Second, BRICS countries face structural economic differences. While G7 economies rely on high-value sectors like technology and finance, BRICS nations are more reliant on sectors like agriculture, manufacturing, and raw materials. Global influence and economic power today. Today, both G7 and BRICS hold major influence over global economics and geopolitics. The G7 still dominates global financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. They have established themselves as leaders in setting economic standards. Meanwhile, BRICS is working on its influence too. The BRICS nations have even launched their own financial institution, the New Development Bank, and they're increasingly trading with each other, bypassing the US dollar in some transactions. This shows that BRICS is not only an economic alliance but also a political force looking to rebalance global power structures. So, what does the future hold for G7 and BRICS? The G7 will likely maintain its GDP per capita advantage, as it's easier for wealthy nations to sustain their development. However, BRICS's combined GDP might continue to approach or even surpass the G7 in the coming decades if China and India maintain their growth. But challenges lie ahead. Both G7 and BRICS face economic uncertainty, from inflation, rising debt, climate change, and shifting supply chains. If BRICS continues to grow in both influence and GDP, it could redefine the world order as we know it. Conclusion. In the end, whether you favor the G7 or BRICS, one thing is clear: the global economic landscape is shifting. The G7 remains strong with high income and stable economies, while BRICS has proven itself as an emerging force that can no longer be ignored. So what do you think? Will BRICS eventually surpass the G7 in influence, or will G7 continue to set the pace? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more deep dives into global economics. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.